There we go. Recording is on. Okay. So we're going to talk today about the Cold War, but we are specifically going to talk about the Cold War in a big picture sense, right? Big picture. We're going to talk about the continuities and changes in Cold War policies. We're going to talk about what the Cold War was. We're going to mention a few key terms and events. And we're going to close everything out talking about the Korean War. And then something to note, right, as we go through the rest of this unit, because the unit is from 45 to 1980, the Cold War will still be in full swing. So the Cold War is not going to go away. It's just going to be something in the background. So we're talking about the big picture today. And then starting tomorrow and later on, we'll get more detailed as we go. So big picture today, and we will get more detailed as we go along. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump in and let's get started with our first key point. Now, the first key point is a lot. There's a lot of words on there. You can summarize it. All you really need to know is that U.S. policy, or I'm sorry, that the U.S. is engaged in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. They both want to limit the U.S., wants to limit the growth of communist power. They want to create a global free market economy, and they want to build an international security system. So basically, the U.S. will be engaged in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. They're looking to limit growth. They're looking to create a free market economy, and they're looking to build an international security system. I'll give you about a minute and a half for that, and then we'll go ahead and get started with some information. About 40 seconds left on the clock. $20 seconds. All right, let's go move forward. So, what is a Cold War? Well, post-World War II, tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union will lead to a Cold War. A Cold War is a conflict between two belligerent nations in which neither nation engages in conventional warfare with one another. Basically, it's a war of ideas. It is not a war with bullets and bombs and tanks and all that stuff. It is a war of ideas. It is a war of influence. It is no fighting, no literal fighting, but just a lot of conflict and tension. That being said, the Cold War itself almost broke out into war multiple times during its, tenure, during its time. And this is an ongoing thing. For that last bit, all you really need to know is that tensions with the U.S. and Communist Russia have been going on since 1917. There were whole entire Red Scares and anti-communist bits of propaganda that were going on pre-Cold War, something not related to the Cold War at all. The U.S. is also really opposed to their totalitarian style of government. In the chat, who's the guy that's in charge of Russia during World War II and immediately after? Who's in charge of the Soviet Union? Got one response. Anybody else? Who's in charge of the Soviet Union? You don't know, but don't know. It starts with an S. It does start with an S. So the guy in charge of the Soviet Union, and if you didn't know him, write his name down, is Joseph Stalin. Stalin. Joseph Stalin is his name. And he is a dictator. He is not a good guy. He was a part of the Allies, but he's only an ally because the U.S. and Great Britain needed him. He's not that great of a guy. He liked to murder people. He liked to lock people in prison. He commits a lot of war crimes. Stalin, not a great guy. So immediately after the Second World War is over and they're not allies anymore, once the Nazis are gone, basically, Stalin and the U.S., right, or the Soviet Union and the U.S. are at odds with one another. Not directly, not through military war, but ideologically, they just oppose each other. So again, I'll give you a quick minute and a half for that bottom part. Just point out that the anti-Russian stuff has been going on for a while. It's just that with the Soviet coming on, it gets a little worse. About a minute left on the clock, and then we'll move forward. Okay, let's go to move forward. So right after World War II, there are a bunch of deals that are going to be broken by the Soviet Union. First of all, the Western allies, the allies during World War II, had agreed that all of these Central European and Eastern European nations here, all of these, would be allowed to hold free elections, and troops would leave those countries, right? Soldiers. But Stalin kept Soviet troops stationed in these countries and used those troops to kind of turn the countries communist. He kind of forced them to become communist states. He did this for a couple of reasons. He wanted to create a buffer zone between Russia and Germany, as well as the other Western allies. This buffer zone will be known as the Iron Curtain. And the Iron Curtain is that line between the red and the blue nations. Also, Germany itself is split into 4 occupation zones, right? And this is the top picture is Germany. One side is the Soviets, one side is the US, the British, and then France gets a little piece of their own. Now, within the Soviet territory, you see this little colored speck. This is the city of Berlin. Berlin is also split into 4 sections, and right here is Berlin. You got a French section, a British section, a US section, a big Soviet section. Now, that is going to lead to some issues because you're going to basically have Western Berlin be a little spot of democracy in a big pile of communism. And it's, for reasons we'll get into, it'll lead to some tension a little later. The reason that there's so much tension in Germany is because the Western countries, like the US, for example, and Britain, and Germany and the Soviet Union want 2 different things. The Soviets want Germany to stay weak because they are scared of German military aggression, right? But the Western nations know that only a strong Germany can help fully repair the economy in Europe. Basically, there will be a political and ideological division in Europe. Europe's going to get split in half. An iron curtain, as Winston Churchill called it, descends upon the continent. So I'll give you a quick minute and a half for that slide. Again, this is an ideological difference. About a minute left on the clock. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Okay, let's go to move forward. So here's a better look at the Iron Curtain, right? This black line is the Iron Curtain. The red states, or the red nations, are the Warsaw Pact nations, and then the blue are the NATO nations, which we'll get into in a little bit. We can get into it now. So again, West Berlin had democracy deep in Soviet-controlled territory, and this was a bad thing for the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union is a totalitarian communist nation. And things are not going great in Soviet-controlled territories. East Berlin is horrible. A lot of East Germany is horrible. There's no food. There's bad working conditions. Everybody's poor. The cities aren't being rebuilt in the same way. It is rough in the Eastern Bloc. And what you see is a bunch of people migrating to the West, whether it's things like pop culture, whether it's things like just availability of resources and food, whether it's better jobs, just a more comfortable, freer living style. West Berlin becomes full of these people. And the Soviet Union and Stalin do not like that people are trying to escape their communist utopia, right? And so what Stalin does is he blockades Berlin. He closes off the roads, he closes off the railroads, he closes off the canals and any access to Berlin. And he's like, there, now how are you going to resupply West Berlin, right? So the U.S. organizes something called the Berlin Airlift. This is the 8th Air Force. These are the same bombers that were dropping bombs in World War II, but they are now dropping supplies into Berlin to keep it from falling under Soviet control. And again, this is just West Berlin. Over 200,000 flights carrying supplies into Berlin kept the Soviets from taking over Berlin. And so West Berlin stays this little beacon of democracy. Later on, two groups will form, two alliances. First one's called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's a military alliance, and it's designed to resist any aggressive actions taken by the Soviet Union. So basically, if the Soviet Union does something, attacks somebody, bam, everybody in NATO goes in. And not to be outdone, the Soviet Union create the Warsaw Pact, which is basically the same deal, just in reverse. Hey, if those pesky, democratic nations do anything, we'll all attack them. So basically, you get the war, the world is kind of split in two, right? One half is in the Warsaw Pact, sort of, and the other half is in the NATO. And again, that's not exactly true. There's a lot of Asian nations and a lot of smaller nations that are involved, but I'm just giving you the meat and potatoes of it all. Again, about a minute and a half from this slide. If you guys have any questions, please let me know. About 20 seconds. Okay, let's go to move forward. So on top of that, and again, this is all big picture background stuff, there will be an arms race that develops between the US and the Soviet Union, right? They're both upset. They both have different ideologies. They're both going to conflict and combat one another. Right? But on top of that, they're all going to start building up arms. Nuclear proliferation. Nuclear proliferation. I don't know why I couldn't say that for a second. Will happen in the world where basically nuclear arms are going to be amassed. Nations all across the world, specifically the US and the Soviet Union, are going to be growing their nuclear arsenal, right? During World War II, there were literally two bombs, right? The Fat Man and the Little Man. But by 1949, the Soviets will test their first atomic bomb. Basically, the bomb the US used that was kind of like a, hey, Soviet Union, back off, look what we have. Well, now the US isn't the only one that has it. Soviets have one too. And on top of that, Truman will create a stronger hydrogen bomb in 1952, which the Soviets will also make their own version of a few years after that. And then they're just going to keep amassing bombs and missiles and all this stuff, nukes, essentially, just big, massive amounts of nukes. The peak of this is in 1986, which, again, we'll get into all the details a little later. But it became clear once everybody had nuclear bombs pointed at each other that these bombs would lead to something called mutually assured destruction. What happens if the entire world just starts shooting nukes at each other? What's going to happen to the planet? Tell me in chat. What do you think is going to happen if everybody starts shooting nukes at one another? Everything's going to be destroyed, right? That's called mutually assured destruction, right? Where nothing's left. Hey, if I throw nukes at you, you're going to throw nukes back at me, and we're both going to be dead, right? Basically kind of like blowing the world up. And this concept of mutually assured destruction kind of keeps the peace, kind of. Nobody's willing to use all of these bombs because they realize that the second they use one, they're just going to have one thrown back at them, right? And this is kind of a tense, uneasy situation that everybody finds themselves in. While this arms race is going on, an arms race is just kind of like, hey, I built this helicopter, I built this tank, right? It's like building different munitions, not just nukes. There will be proxy wars fought during this time. There's a whole bunch of proxy wars we could get into. We're only really going to talk about two in this unit. Basically, what a proxy war is like a stand-in. So the Soviets and the US aren't fighting each other in these wars, but the Soviets and the US are supporting, sides. We'll talk specifically about Vietnam, and we'll talk about Korea and what's going on in those wars. Vietnam will get its own day. Korea we'll talk about in a little bit. I'll give you a quick minute and a half, and then we'll actually move on. But just know that a proxy war is like not direct fighting. It's kind of like that, but no. So basically the Soviets will pay and supply, and so will the US. And sometimes one side has troops in, but they're not fighting the other side's troops. Like in Vietnam, where there's American troops in Vietnam, but they're fighting the Vietnamese. They're not fighting the Soviets. But it's pretty clear that the Soviets are like supplying the Vietnamese, things like that. About 30 seconds. All right, let's go to move forward. So, which key term is present in this image. There's 2, maybe 3 that you should be able to see. What do you notice? What is in here? What key terms that we just talked about are in this image? Let me know in chat. Just realized it. Let me know in chat. What do you see? Okay, what else? Right, but what are the key terms, right? So there was some key terms on the last slide that we talked about. What do you see in here? There's a couple you could find. There's 2 to 3 you could find. Yep, that's one. So I see 2 so far. There's one more that I'm looking for, and then I'll kind of talk about what you see here. There's one more that I'm looking for. Yeah, Annalise, that's good. Michaela, that's a really good one. We'll talk about why in a second. The actual last class missed that one, so we'll talk about it in a bit. Anybody else? The third one? Also, Alex, you're on the right track. So what would that key term be, right? Because you are on the, that's correct. You're explaining it correctly. If nobody else has anything, I'll go ahead and explain these because I don't want to spend too much time on them. So the 2 terms that are on here, right, or the couple of the terms on here, there you go. Okay, we nailed it. Okay, so we got all the terms, I think. One is mutually assured destruction, right? That's very clear here, right? On no account to be used because the enemy might retaliate, and how they're going to retaliate with their own nukes, right? These are very clearly U.S. and Soviets. Who was it? Credit or credits to Michaela said proxy war, and you're right. And right, a proxy war is a stand-in. And what you can kind of argue as proxy war here is the fact that they have all these nukes behind them, but what are they doing instead? They're shooting arrows at each other, right? They're not like actually fighting themselves. They're sort of fighting, but not really. Mutually assured destruction. And then lastly, nuclear proliferation, right? The idea of building up all of these nukes, building them up and adding to your nuclear stockpile. Fun stories about nukes. Throughout the Cold War, the U.S. will lose about 14 nuclear bombs. They'll find them, they'll all be accounted for, but it happened often enough that there's a name for what happens when you lose a nuke in the U.S. It's called a broken arrow. It's basically like, uh-oh, we lost a nuke. Let's find that before bad things happen. And the U.S. lost 14. We don't know how many the Soviets lost. Fun times. Okay, so all we have to know for key point 2 is that second bit of it, right? The United States developed foreign policies based on collective security, international aid, and economic institutions that bolstered non-communist nations. Basically, the U.S. is going to be like the piggy bank of democracy. Anytime that democracy is in danger, the U.S. is going to throw money at the problem to try to fix it. Anytime communism, I should say, is in danger of spreading, the U.S. is going to throw money at the problem to try to fix it. I'll give you about a minute and a half, and then we'll get into all of this stuff on the next slides. About 40 seconds. All right, let's go to move forward. So there's going to be two policies we're going to talk about. The first one is a policy of containment. Containment itself is basically the containment policy is going to be known as the Truman Doctrines. President Harry Truman, who kind of put it into place. The Truman Doctrine was this policy where basically anytime a country was threatened by communism or threatened by the spread of communism, the U.S. threw every resource it had into preventing that. There are examples of all over the place where communism is in danger of spreading there, and the U.S. gets involved in South America, in Europe, in the Middle East, all over the place. For example, in Turkey and Greece alone, the United States will spend over $400 million in aid and military support. Anytime there's a nation, whether it's a good nation or a bad nation, that is threatening to go communist, or that is in threat of being, attacked by the Soviet Union and taken over, the U.S. will do everything in its power to support the not communist leader, even if the not communist leader is not a good guy. The U.S. will support a dictator if that dictator is not a communist. To put in perspective, I'll give you guys another example. I'm sure you all are familiar or remember Osama bin Laden, right? The Al-Qaeda fighter that attacked the United States on 9/11. He was killed by some Navy SEALs a few years ago under President Obama. Yes or no in the chat, really quick, just nuke it. Do you guys know who trained Osama bin Laden in some of his insurgency styles? Again, just a real quick yes or no in the chat. Knows. The CIA in the United States are the ones who trained Osama bin Laden back when he was fighting with the Mujahideen to fight the Soviet Union. They not only kind of showed them how to do things like attack supply lines, how to insurgent correctly, they also gave them supplies like Stinger missile launchers and surface-to-air missiles and things like that. So yeah, and again, trained is a strong word, but they definitely helped him out. The CIA kind of showed bin Laden how to do certain things. They definitely gave him supplies and money to buy weapons. It is the nature of containment. It is a side effect of it. They supported anybody who wasn't communist, they being the United States. Some of those decisions made then have come back to kick the world in the butt every now and then, right? In fact, when the U.S. will invade Afghanistan a little later, right, in 2001, 2, 3, there is without a doubt, like CIA bought missile launchers and stuff in that place shooting at Americans later on. It's just the nature of their containment policy. It didn't matter. It wasn't important. About 50 seconds. And again, if you guys have questions, let me know as we go through. Try to answer them. But this is containment. Containment, basically a good way to tell them apart is if needed, the military does get involved. Whether it's training, whether it's providing supplies, whether it's direct military intervention. With containment, the military will get involved when necessary. About 30 seconds left. And then with the next one, we're going to talk about the Marshall Plan. It's more about money. All right, let's go to move forward. Again, the Truman Doctrine, the idea is throw money and support at nations so they do not fall victim to the virus of communism. Communism is bad. So let's get into the Marshall Plan. Secretary of State John Marshall had a plan to support European countries that were struggling post-World War II. Remember, a lot of these countries were literally destroyed, figuratively destroyed, and were suffering from all sorts of things. Over $13 billion will be put in financial aid for European nations so those nations could rebuild themselves. Post-World War II, to some Western European nations, let's say, communism seems like a good plan early on. Hey, everybody work together. Hey, everybody gets paid equally, right? Fair share, the people, all that stuff. The parts about prison camps, the parts about murder, the parts about Stalin being a dictator, like that stuff was not played up. But the deal, right? The idea of communism, hey, communism is a pretty fair deal. That's not something that people really, that's something that people thought. It's not until Marshall puts his plan into place that people realize, oh, okay, democracy is better. And what's Marshall's plan? It's essentially, hey, throw money at all these nations, right? Invest in their rebuilding, help them rebuild. And once he does that, a lot of these nations are backing away from communism. So it works. Marshall's plan works. He supports the rebuilding financially, that is, right, of these nations, and it prevents them from going communist. If you need any questions, let me know. But there's about a minute left on the clock. About 20 seconds left. All right, so key point 3 is up. Concerned by expansionist communist ideology and Soviet repression, the United States sought to contain communism through a variety of measures. Obviously, right, we've already kind of been saying that, but this included major military engagements in Korea. So in 1950, a war will break out in Korea, and in about a minute and change, we will talk about that war, why it started, what happened, and what's going on. About 30 seconds left. Okay. go to move forward. So the Korean War. After World War II, Korea is divided along the 38th parallel. That's the name of the line. And basically you have US-led South, not US-led, US-supported South Korea and Soviet-supported North Korea. But in June of 1950, North Koreans will invade the South. The Soviet Union provided the munitions and the supplies the North Vietnamese used. The UN, not US, will send a bunch of troops that are mostly American to support the South Vietnamese. Under General Douglas MacArthur, the UN force will push Northern troops all the way up to the southern border of China. China is not okay with this, so they send troops in to push the UN all the way back to the 38th parallel again. So basically, the lines don't really change here. China gets involved a little bit in 1950 just to kind of, and the UN pushes back to kind of be like, whoa, you know, because no one wants to go to, they don't want to go to war with China. And two things to know about this conflict is it's a proxy war between the US and the Soviets, right? The US is on boots on the ground, but the Soviets are not boots on the ground. They're not involved. They're just supporting the people the UN forces are fighting. This is also a direct result of Truman's containment policy. Because Truman wanted to contain communism, when communism was in danger of spreading throughout all of Korea, the US and the UN intervened in order to stop it. This is going to come back later when we talk about Vietnam in a few days. I'll give you a quick minute on this slide, a minute and change, and then we'll move on to the last slide, and we will talk about what we're doing for an exit ticket. About 20 seconds, then we'll move forward. All right, let's go to move forward. Again, a few images from the war. This is the Korean War Memorial in Washington. A lot of American troops fighting. Again, American troops were on the ground. It's South Vietnamese, I believe. Vietnamese, Korean, South Korean, sorry. And another American soldier, Soviet-era machine gun. Just, you know, stuff worth pointing out. Okay. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move forward from the Korean War. Let's talk about the very last thing we're going to talk about. Last key point, last slide of information. A big thing to point out about the Cold War throughout the 60-ish years that it's going on is that there will be periods of direct and indirect confrontation, right? Where either it's something like Korean or Vietnam War, where there's actual fighting going on, but again, never between the Soviets and the US directly. There will be times when the Soviets and the US are about to go to war with one another, things like the Cuban Missile Crisis that we'll talk about a little later. But there will also be times of mutual like coexistence. This is known as détente, like peaceful times, where they're not really mad at each other. They're still kind of like tense, right? They're still not quite friends, but they're mutually existing separately from one another. There will be times of that as well. And a lot of that will depend on who's president, but mostly who's in charge of the Soviet Union. Because the Soviet Union post-Stalin is going to go through so many people, and they are varying degrees of good and varying degrees of aggressive and things like that. So with that being said, I'll leave this up for about a minute and a half, then we'll talk about our exit ticket. About a minute left on the clock. Shouldn't need too much more than that. About 30 seconds, and then we'll move forward and we'll talk about our exit ticket, and we'll be just about done. All right, let's go to move forward. So exit ticket, Cold War exit ticket should be the only one in the exit ticket tab. Pretty straightforward, name, email address, all that good stuff. Multiple choice question. Read it carefully. Don't rush it because you might get thrown off. A couple of key terms based on the image here, or a couple of key terms, a couple of short answers based on the cartoon we looked at on the slides. And then a quick question to explain the significance of the impact of the Marshall and Truman doctrine. Be brief, keep it to 1 to 2 examples. Don't give me an essay. It's just a short answer. Other than that, guys, though, the exit ticket is all I have for you. So if you are good to go. Make sure you submit it.